Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Kim Ossie. I'm the Associate Director of Planet Forward at the George Washington University. We're just delighted to host this conversation today in partnership with our friends over at the American Bird Conservancy. Before we get into our conversation with our amazing panelists, I just want to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, you can turn on your captions in the closed caption icon at the bottom of the screen if you would like to do that. Also, we're recording this webinar and we will post it to both of the Planet Forward and the American Bird Conservancy's YouTube channels after the event. Definitely keep an eye on the chat and feel free to contribute there as well. We'll be providing some useful links there, and those also will go out in a follow-up email after the event to everybody who registered. And last thing, if you think of questions as we're doing our conversation, we would please ask you to use the Q&A box so that your fellow attendees can upvote their favorite questions and we can get them answered. So to give you a little background on the two organizations who are hosting the event today, I'm from Planet Forward, and we are an educational project hosted out of the George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. We work with diverse students all across the country and faculty, not just from GW, and we teach them how to communicate better about science, sustainability, and the environment, and various topics, of course, including conservation. We do this through programs, experiential learning opportunities, and events like this. To learn more, you can go to our website at planetforward.org. And we also highly encourage you to sign up for our weekly newsletter. That is actually, as a special tip for you all attending today, we will be sharing how to apply to our brand new Frontline Climate Reporting Fellowship in the newsletter in the coming weeks. So keep an eye out for that. Our partner today, the American Bird Conservancy, is a nonprofit dedicated to conserving wild birds and habitats throughout the Americas. And Naamal de Silva from the American Bird Conservancy is here with us to lead today's conversation around fellowships. Naamal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm Naamal de Silva. I'm the Vice President for our Together for Birds work at American Bird Conservancy. I also have my doctorate is from George Washington University, and I have taught there in environmental justice and community engagement. I love student perspectives and think that it's very exciting to partner with Planet Forward. I believe that storytelling around all aspects of sustainability, including conservation, is a huge part of the solution to a lot of the problems facing us. Fellowships are a particularly fascinating topic for me, and it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk with people who have received fellowships and who run fellowship programs. That's my quick intro, Kim, but I have lots of questions for the panelists.
Well, before we get into that with our panelists, could you briefly define conservation for us?
Yeah, conservation or biodiversity conservation tends to focus on protecting wild places and wild species. Often those species are threatened with extinction. American Bird Conservancy focuses on the protection of birds largely through protecting or stewarding wild places. The term conservation itself has also the implication of reserving these places and species for our future use. Natural resource conservation has that implication, but there's different ways of thinking about it.
Very helpful, thank you. And then just so we're also on the same page around what is a fellowship? How is it different from an internship or like a full-time job? Can you help us with that as well?
Yeah, a fellowship, in my view, and again, just like with the word conservation, there's many definitions of what a fellowship could be. But it's different from an internship. Internships are usually entry-level positions that enable you to get a sense of an organization, but also do tend to have a lot of administrative tasks involved and don't have much research or independent work often, not always. Fellowships often, but not always, require a bit more work experience or life experience or communications experience, but do often allow more space for independent research or thinking, or community engagement. They are still short term. They can be paid or unpaid. In this conversation, we're largely talking about paid fellowships, and they are a way to get you to the next thing, I think. Whether that's research, there's postdoctoral fellowships that are for people who already have doctorates. There are mid-career or early career fellowships, so they vary. But they are meant to help you progress in your conservation career or environmental career.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really excited to hear from our panelists today. So Naamal, I'll let you go ahead and get them introduced.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you so much for co-hosting this with us. So to get us started, Katia and Harrison, could you come back on screen as well? I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves very briefly. Let's start with Harrison and have you just introduce yourself in your own words and also mention the topic. And Carl, please be on screen as well, because we'll do quick intros of all of you. Your fellowship, your conservation and justice fellowship topic, and an intro of you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for getting us started, Kim and Naamal. I'm happy to be a part of this webinar today, this conversation today, because I'm representing not only American Bird Conservancy as an inaugural Conservation and Justice Fellow, but I'm also representing Planet Forward as one of their inaugural student correspondents from, I believe, 2017. So I'm currently a graduate student, a PhD student at Princeton University, and a new father. I like to throw that around a lot because I feel like that's really given me a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, and a sense of grounding in life. And briefly about my fellowship itself. So I worked with the pesticides campaign program, looking at the effects of neonicotinoids on farm worker health and sort of the history of the role of farm workers, specifically migrant farm workers, within the industrial agricultural system, specifically within North America, but its relationships, because this is the American Bird Conservancy, to Canada and Latin and Central and Latin America as well.
Thank you, Harrison. Yeah, I think parenthood is one of those defining life-changing things if you are fortunate enough to have children. Katia, could you please introduce yourself and your Conservation and Justice Fellowship topic as well?
Yes, hi everyone, good to be here. I'm very grateful to have been invited to speak here and to have been able to participate in the first cohort of the Conservation and Justice Fellowships. As well, I am a sustainability researcher, community organizer, and storyteller. And I've been focused on improving the reciprocal interconnections between people and nature, while increasing equity for underserved and Indigenous people. And sustainability became my passion 15 years ago when I learned that climate change is threatening the health of my people and my environments. And as I learned how our social and environmental exploitation are connected. So since then, I became impassioned to take action, and I've directed transdisciplinary initiatives that are focused on advancing the environmental and social visions of my communities. I am right now a graduate student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I'm working on graduate research that connects to this fellowship. I am supporting leaders to center their social ecological relationships and resilience. And through this fellowship, I was able to meet them, my collaborators, through the Indigenous Kinship Circle. So that was my project with the Conservation and Justice Fellowship. And the Indigenous Kinship Circle is a cross-boundary community of practice working to support Indigenous people, their well-being, and their communities across the central grasslands of Turtle Island. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Katia. And Carl, could you introduce yourself to us as well? Your role with American Bird Conservancy, but also just some of what you've been researching and writing and working on over the years.
Sure, absolutely. Great to be here with everybody. My name is Carl Safina. I am an ecologist by training. Well, I'm a nature lover by nature. I'm an ecologist by training. I studied seabirds and birds of prey, and the seabird studies got me involved in efforts to basically revise and reform the laws that govern fishing in the United States, to bring it from a period where the laws directed everybody to go out and catch more, which was depleting our coastal oceans, to a mandate to allow depleted populations to recover. And then after that phase of my work, I began writing mostly about the oceans, how they were changing, what that meant for wildlife and people of the sea. And more recently, my books have had to do with the human relationship with the natural world quite generally, and how our values really determine how we think about and how we treat the world around us. Well, and everything too, you know, how we treat people, how we treat the living world, and how we think about things. It's all really based in our values and where our values come from. So my role with American Bird Conservancy is I am on the board, and that comes out of all the work that I did in the past with birds and with conservation. I've actually had, I think I just listed them here. I've had 5 fellowships myself, from Pew, from the World Wildlife Fund, from the from the National Academies of Science, from the Guggenheim Foundation, and from the MacArthur Foundation. And in addition, my small not-for-profit group, the Safina Center, has a fellowship program. So I think that's why Naamal invited me here today, because I have a lot of experience with conservation and fellowships.
It is why I invited you, Carl. I think with our Conservation and Justice Fellowship program being so new, it really helps to get input from people who have themselves held fellowships, but also other people who run fellowship programs. I think we learn from each other, and that idea of centering care in conservation and in the work that we do is so vital. And I'd like to have a sense, starting with Carl. Sorry, apologies. Starting with Carl, to get a sense of how these fellowships might have influenced your whole career path. When we're kids, we are often asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Which suggests a single fixed destination. I will be an accountant. I will be a lawyer. But conservation careers are often much more winding than that. And fellowships are, I think, an interesting way to mark some of the points in that journey of thinking about what you do as much more of a journey than a single fixed destination. Carl.
Well, I once said to the very famous oceanographer and ocean conservationist Sylvia Earle, who is now, I think she is now 88 years old. I said, "Sylvia, I want to be like you when I grow up." And she said, "Well, the secret to that is never grow up." So I took that to heart. I think that's very good advice. Um, when I grew up, I wanted to be an ecologist. I really was a working ecologist, studying birds, wild birds, for about a decade. And then I realized that there was a policy need. So then I wanted to be a very effective policy advocate, and a person who developed policies that were in place that really changed things. And then I wanted to write about these kinds of topics because there were some books that really inspired me a lot when I was young. And I think writing and books can be very powerful. So that's at least 3 things that I wanted to be when I grew up. That spans about 30 years of my work, and I now speak a lot about things I've written about. So in a way, that's 4 different things. that have been part of my working career. The fellowships I've had have had very different, they've had very different goals, and they've had very different effects on my life and work. I would say that they can have a very minor effect, and they can have a very life transformative effect. And of these fellowships that I spoke of, uh, two of them were on opposite ends of that spectrum. One was really transformative in my work, and therefore in the whole trajectory of my life. Some of them are much more open-ended. They say, you're a person who seems to know what you want to do. Here's some money and time to go do it. Others are much more targeted. Give us a proposal about what you will do if we award you this fellowship, and you get the fellowship, and that allows you to do and requires you to do something that you have proposed. I think most fellowships, in contrast to things like internships, they're more there to support work that you have already conceived of yourself. So you're not really working for a boss or for a team particularly, although it can really be whatever the fellowship defines. And I think that sums up kind of the range. Some fellowships actually have real fellowship built into them. You get to know other people who were fellows. You get to go to meetings with other people who were fellows. Those meetings happen sometimes at really amazing places. And then others don't really have, they're called fellowships, I guess because they're given to a certain group of people every year, but they don't really have opportunities for you to meet the other people or mingle or develop any kind of working partnerships. So there's not, I guess one of the take homes is there's a sort of a range of things fellowships can be, but there's not one thing that is really meant by the word fellowship.
Thanks, Carl. One quick follow-up question. Which one was transformative for you and why?
The Pew Fellowship was the most transformative for me. It changed the whole trajectory of my life. And that's because it gave me the time. The money supported enough time for me to write a first book. And that book, for a couple of reasons, basically changed the whole path of my working life from then on. And I really stopped doing the ecological research in the field. I had stopped doing that to do the policy work. I stopped doing the policy work to focus on writing books. I've been writing books for about the last 20 years and speaking about what I've written. And I think, that would not have happened if I had not gotten that particular fellowship.
Thank you. I love Sylvia's advice too of never growing up, because I think what that really suggests is stay curious. And that seems to be what you've been doing with each of these projects, each book, each shift in that trajectory. Thank you.
I think actually, in many ways, I feel like I feel more curious, and I am much more awestruck about the miracle of life on Earth as time goes on. A lot of people, when they're young or in their teens, they will say, there's nothing to do. I don't know what to do. And I feel like as time goes on, I get like light years away from that feeling. It just seems like everything requires so much attention, is so fascinating. The world seems not only like scientifically interesting, but just utterly miraculous and so far beyond the ability of any person to even hope to take in more than a small fraction of it in the course of a lifetime. And I feel, You know, it's a very motivating feeling. It can be very overwhelming and humbling feeling too, but I'm very appreciative that I feel that way. Let's put it that way.
Thank you, Carl. Katia, shifting over to you, could you talk a little bit about how this one fellowship, the Conservation and Justice Fellowship, has influenced your goals and direction?
Yes, to say that this fellowship has been life-changing is cutting it short, because it has really influenced my perspectives on the world, my community organizing, my educational and career goals. I wanted to do this fellowship because I was already a member of the IKC, but I also wanted to really be able to delve more into how conservation and justice connects to Indigenous perspectives. Because I am mestiza, which is mixed Indigenous and European, but very much disconnected from Indigenous teachings. Mestizos are very Westernized. And I wanted to learn more about how Indigenous perspectives connect to that experience. But I also wanted to support, because I was doing my graduate education. I really wanted it to support Indigenous people. I wanted it to be done in service. And so I saw this fellowship as a way for me to continue giving back while I was doing the work, and having my graduate education be useful while it was happening. And through this fellowship, I was connected to amazing Indigenous leaders from throughout the continent, all focused on advancing social and environmental conditions for Indigenous people. And I was very grateful to support their diverse efforts. I helped with doing equitable engagement and creating a community-driven strategy, engaging Indigenous people from Mexico. And so the time this fellowship allowed me to really delve more into how justice and conservation connect to Indigenous efforts really helped me think a lot about the work I was doing. I was doing a lot of research on Indigenous conservation for my graduate education. But this fellowship really allowed me to delve into how the history and the ongoing impacts of conservation are impacting Indigenous people. And it really helped. I would say one of the biggest things it did was changed my approach and perspective and framework that I use in my community organizing and work. For a long time, I have known that social and environmental conditions are interconnected, because my communities, immigrant, underserved, are living interconnected social and environmental exploitation. Sorry, that was long. We're living social and environmental exploitation that are interconnected. So that has really guided a lot of my work, community organizing, education. But as I worked with IKC, I was able to really learn about how Indigenous social ecological relationships shaped all our ecosystems, or social ecological systems, or just nature. That's what Indigenous people say throughout the world, nature. We're all part of nature. And it just really reinforced to me how so many of the solutions for conservation and justice are connected to Indigenous perspectives, especially sustainability. And in conservation, so many of the practices we are doing are based on Indigenous knowledge. And so it connected me to how not only are social and environmental exploitation connected for my people, but social and environmental relationships that we have, that our ancestors have, are also essential for healing a lot of our social ecological systems. And so it really changed my perspective to see it as well as like more of like how our perspectives are also essential, not just because we have insider knowledge about how exploitation is connected and it can change, but also because Indigenous people and so many communities of color have essential knowledge that are land-based for improving social and environmental conditions. So that has shaped my, I'm probably going to keep working in that. I don't know in what, but something that allows me to work that.
I think what you're saying too, Katia, really highlights the idea of the necessity of expanding who's considered an expert in conservation in this field, whose knowledge is influencing the work that's done or needs to influence the work that's done when we're talking about protecting a bird species or protecting a wild place or nature more broadly. Who's considered an expert, what knowledge needs to be recovered or brought back in, and how and who can work together to do this more effectively. And I think as you were talking, those are some of the things that I was thinking about. We have an additional panelist, it looks like, and I'll turn it over to Harrison to talk a little bit about how the fellowship might have changed your goals or direction or research interests as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll do it like this. I'll tell a story, because my I don't think that my research, my graduate research necessarily reflects what it is that I've done with the fellowship. My graduate research is great, but I think this journey for me, with regards to topics around entanglement, really began back in 2018. Where I was studying pesticides in Tyrone Hayes's lab at UC Berkeley. I won't tell his story because I feel like I wouldn't do it justice, and it's not really my responsibility to tell his story. Um, but I was really training to be a lab coat, and I feel like now I'm training in graduate school to be a field notebook. And no disrespect to that, that's very valuable and that's important. But I've always been fascinated by the sense of entanglement within my research, and the fact that, conservation and justice are pretty much the same idea. I think that one of the most valuable things about this fellowship has been sort of me relearning that, the value of that, and re-experiencing that and reinforcing that within my work, and that's something I can't get away from. So I started researching pesticides back in 2018, and their effects on amphibians. In 2020, during COVID, I was driving my wife back home from Tahoe to Mississippi, and along the way, we drove through Central Valley, California, the lower Central Valley, in between these, hazy fields of, you know, all sorts of modern day industrial agricultural plantations. And throughout the field, you'd see people dotted, with umbrellas over their heads, in a white van, um, off to the side of them, which at the time sort of, I guess, like, what's the word? Not ignorantly, but just sort of like, was saying, oh, that's the modern day sort of slave driver setup. But throughout this fellowship, I've learned how much, how much the modern day wage labor system within industrial agriculture is fundamentally rooted within the same sort of system of slavery that, oppressed and continues to oppress Black people across classes today. And the fact that that's so valuable because, you know, in that sort of separation from natural ecological systems and our understanding of the flows of nature itself, these people don't realize that the pesticides that they're exposed to affect them in the exact same way that it affects birds that are flying around them, that they cannot see because they do not have the opportunity to take it in, even though they're out in the field 12 to 16 hours a day. They don't even know that birds around them are dying. And if they do, they can't say it because they don't have time to say it. And so for me, I've really struggled with that, taking, and I'm glad that Carl, I'm glad that you've explained your journey, because it helps me understand how long it's going to take for me to work through my own journey, because I'm hoping to go into policy after this. A lot of my work, my fellowship was policy related, a lot of advocacy, a lot of coalition building. How can we form relationships with farm worker justice groups and American Bird Conservancy to, help make changes within industrial agricultural systems to reunite people with the environment around them. And then hopefully go on and write about that. In fact, that was, I think, one of the most fundamental and transformative aspects of this work for me, was in engaging with artists and people who are not, traditionally trained as scientists, re-engaging that sort of creative writing process, writing poetry, writing long form prose, and finding new ways to engage with science that goes beyond, which are important, the sort of rudimentary scientific analyses that give us a system of knowledge based in Western epistemologies. And as Katia was mentioning, reintegrating that back into, indigenous knowledge systems through this creative writing process that bridges these two forms of thought, and also bridges, multiple forms of histories that have been hidden through, mountains of legal documents and policy documents that, have been underappreciated throughout time, speaking about, labor systems and the development of labor systems within, Western society, and specifically the Americas. So that's a long winding road of sort of explaining what I've learned and what I've gotten out of this fellowship.
Thank you, Harrison. And hearing what you were saying right after what Katia was saying makes me think that part of the role of a fellowship too is to connect ways of knowing, different perspectives. Katia, you and I have talked some about oral storytelling and the way in which we communicate a story and how it changes from telling to retelling, versus a story that's written down as a moment in time, or this sort of basic research, not in a negative way, but basic research as in answering very specific questions. That's also captured in a moment, but then it changes over time as additional researchers build on that knowledge. And I think it's just so fascinating, the connections in between. Carl earlier brought up the idea of fellowship as in being able to connect with other people. We did have a cohort for the Conservation and Justice Fellowship Program. Would either of you, Harrison or Katia, want to mention anything that you learned from the other fellows?
Yeah, I can go. Because I sort of touched on it, in my first answer, but I really think that, um, you know, I think the thing that I learned the most from fellows is that there's not one way to do science. That it's not this monolithic, figure or form or institution within, as we understand it, and that it is as much artistic as it is analytical. And and it also is it's rooted in activism as well, and sort of like, in terms of this idea of what is most valuable for us to be pushing forward. At least at, like, my advisor likes to say, the highest level of science, what is it that we're pushing forward? And then how does that interact with the world, of activists and artists, or even just regular people who, like, are just living out in the world that we're trying to understand. And I think that was, what I took away from the group most, at its most base, at the most base interactions, was that all of these that entanglement cannot be sterilized out of these ways of learning and ways of knowing, which was Naamal, as we've talked about a lot. That idea of sterilization has been coming up a lot in my work as a result of this fellowship, and entanglement is such a necessary response to this idea of sterilization, that I wouldn't have gotten out of if we didn't have such a multidisciplinary group in our initial cohort.
Thank you, Harrison. Yeah, we've talked about sterilization in the context of pesticides and in the context of lawns and other spaces that do not have that rich biological diversity, but also more narrow ways of thought. And I think that's a fascinating strand of discussion. Katia, I'm actually going to ask you to answer a question from our audience. David Perez asked a question for you specifically, and I'll read it to you. I'm hoping that you could elaborate more on kinship. What forms of Indigenous kinship inspires your research and career interests? I'm familiar with the KA, the Dine, or Navajo kinship system, and generally interested in other Indigenous sciences and kinship systems that you find illuminating personally. And he says thank you. Or they say thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think you can paste the question in the chat so I could look at it a bit?
Yes. And if you want to think through your response, I could ask Carl a question while you are looking at that. This was the question from the Q&A box. Yeah, let me give you a minute to think about that. And then Carl, I have a question for you, sort of following up from talking about your own journey and your the fellowships that have influenced your trajectory. Could you tell us a little bit about starting a fellowship program through the Safina Center? What motivated you to do that? And what's one thing you've learned from one of your fellows or from the group of fellows that you've had so far?
What motivated me to do that was that I wanted to, well, I guess because none of us have enough time to do all the things we wanted to do. So I wanted to find people who were doing things that were like the things I'd like to do and help them do it and help them do more of it. I also wanted to be around people whose work I found energizing and inspiring. And that's why. So we look for some people who are already doing things, so they come to our attention because of things they're already doing. And what they're doing is something that has to do with nature or the environment or environmental justice. To me, it's all the same, really. And they are not just doing factual work, but creative products and creative work that is based on topics having to do with basically nature and the environment.
Thank you. What are a couple of topics that your fellows have discussed or researched or focused on?
Oh, it's been all over the place. Everything from some topics having to do with food and agriculture to indigenous people to animal and land conservation to racial aspects of conservation and environmental justice to one person was a sound artist. He called it music. I call it recordings. It was beatbox music that was mainly made with sounds produced by non-human beings. So it's been all over the place, and I'll say just in answer to, not an answer, but in response to a comment that Harrison made about something I was talking about, that, a journey is a journey. It's not that there's a destination and then you get there. If that happens to you, you be aware that you're now a little stuck. So you should look for, what is the path of the journey, and always feel like you're journeying, I guess, is what I would hope for all of us.
Yes, till the end of life. there should always be a next something, an idea to explore, a person to connect with. I really like that.
Mm.
Thank you, Carl. Katia, back to you.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. It really has me thinking as well about the approach and how my background and my current work has connected to kinship. So yeah, for many years I've been driven to support the healing of our social and environmental interconnections. And so this was greatly influenced by my mestiza, cultural, and immigrant background, because that really reinforced a sense of community and responsibility, because that is how being Mexican, I don't want to generalize, but a lot of Mexican people are really grounded in their family and their community. And then being an immigrant as well, just growing up seeing how we helped each other, and even when we had very little. And actually this background is what got me interested in climate change when I was in 8th grade. I wanted to be a vegetarian, tried to convince my mom about why I should be a vegetarian, learned about climate change. And so then I learned about how what was harming my people was also harming our environments. And so I've been really driven by this interconnections. I don't usually say kinship, I say interconnections, but in a way they are the same. And yeah, being able to work with IKC and through my graduate work in collaboration with Lakota leaders, I've definitely been able to learn more about how Indigenous people approach kinship. And I don't want to speak for these diverse cultures and how they approach kinship, but what I can say is that in this work, it's really what keeps coming up is how there are diverse Indigenous sciences. So even when we say Indigenous science, that's a little bit erasing the diversity within that, but as well as how Indigenous sciences are often connected to cultural traditions and to culture, to languages, to agroecosystems. And in a way, they are all the same. So it's not like you can really separate it. Like this is the science and this is the agroecosystem. And so the IKC, the approach we have taken with this is recognizing that it's all connected. And we're working, as we're doing this work to support Indigenous people and grasslands, something we say is that the resilience of Indigenous people is essential to the resilience of grasslands, because through Western and Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous people have always known this, that their social ecological relationships have shaped and have this ancestral connection to the land, and how it's very important to support Indigenous kinship to restore and conserve. I hope I answered some of your question. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Katia. And for any of the panelists, feel free to add in more links to things that you're talking about, or other resources for our audience. We have a few more questions that were submitted by people as they were registering for the webinar. But I wanted to just ask a general question. We've been talking about a lot of the interconnections, a lot of the barriers and things we're worried about. In thinking about in moving sort of outward from your own personal journeys and the fellowships to the conservation field broadly, what do you hope, and any of you can answer this, what do you hope for the future for the field of conservation?
I will jump in on this.
Sure.
I don't know if this is going to come across in the way that I'm thinking about it right now, because I'm still stuck in the weeds of it, but more so just like decentering like human beings in the idea of conservation. Um, I think that we often think about, you know, or at least like, I won't say we, because you then you gotta unpack who this we is, and we can be here all day about that. But previous, and not all previous, but most previous um leaders within the field of conservation are thinking about a very specific group of people who have a very specific group of or value on nature, that may be tied to its exoticism, or just any sort of, distance from the mundanity of life. And I feel like I would hope that in the future, we can move away from people being at the center, because then it allows us to move away from these, ideas of who is we, and what is the reality that's wrapped up in that we, and allows everyone, and other than human individuals as well, to consider the holism and the web in which we are all sort of wrapped up in together, and live amongst one another in some way, maybe not entirely peacefully, but nature is not entirely peaceful. Um, um, into the future, long into the future. Yeah. So I guess that's my hope for conservation.
Thank you,
I'm
Harry.
going to voice a dissenting view.
Do.
Actually, I think we agree, even though it's going to sound dissenting. But I'd like to center conservation around people, because right now, so this is only a different way of saying what I think you're saying, because right now people see people and conservation as very separate things. Like, we think nature is in Yellowstone, the way cornflakes are in the cereal aisle. We don't understand that we live on a living planet, the living planet, that we are part of the family of life that has been on this journey of self-proliferation for 3.5 billion years. It's all one thing. And that justice for people and justice for the living world is really part of all one thing. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that people should see conservation as part of the fabric of life. And I think that, I think earlier on, conservation was a couple of different things. It was sparked by the alarm of people over the massive destruction of the natural world, the massive and rapid destruction. That's why it was mostly an American thing, in the way it's written about, and in the people that we associate with it. There were other forms of conservation that had to do with the much slower depletion. There's a lot of indigenous conservation practices. They're not concerned about extinction or things like, the reduction of buffalo from American bison from 60 million to 2 dozen, but things like just noticing that you can deplete the lagoon around an island where you're fishing. So this was in the South Pacific. Many indigenous people in the South Pacific would close off certain lagoons for a certain number of time, a certain period of years, and then they would move on. That is a kind of conservation. Other indigenous people believed that creatures made themselves available to people, and they had to be treated with utmost respect, or they would stop making themselves available. I would say that that is scientifically not true, but the reality of it is that when you do treat animals and the rest of the world with disrespect, it becomes unavailable. It goes away. So there was a deeper truth behind those practices. In Europe, there was a different idea of utilitarianism, which was the idea of maintaining enough of nature so that it could keep giving people what they wanted to take from it. And we've gotten to the point where we generally don't think about those things. We just take and take and take, and that is kind of the root of maybe all of the perspectives on conservation, is just things are disappearing. We are killing off the wild populations. We are shrinking the wild places. And what comes with that disrespect is, in fact, the total disruption of the stability of the world that we live in terms most vividly coming back to bite us in terms of the climate disruption that is now sparking the fires, the heat, the droughts, the floods, all of these things. So I think people need to stop seeing conservation as something about birds or about preventing some species from going extinct, and start seeing it as about taking care of life on Earth, all life on Earth, human life, non-human life, the entire family.
I think that's exactly what each of us has been sort of leaning towards, is reducing the disconnection. When Harrison was talking about entanglement, that suggests that we are part of each other's lives. We're not these isolated, independent units moving through space, separate from the birds, separate from the old trees, separate from the old stories and old ways of knowing, that we really are all connected. There was a question in the chat from Kingsley Kwame Nkrumah, saying, I want to understand this. In what ways do Indigenous perspectives on conservation and environmental management differ from mainstream conservation approaches? I'll start on that one and mention that it often is about disconnection. Different Indigenous systems and ways of knowing and groups of people have different ideas, but many suggest and highlight and emphasize this system of connections, connections between people and groups of people, connections that we are part of the wildness in the world, that we are relatives. The birds are our relatives. The mushrooms are our relatives as well. Robin Wall Kimmerer often is quoted as saying, all flourishing is mutual. And it's emphasizing that mutuality and that reciprocity and the respect for all life. I think that that's one of the things that we in mainstream conservation don't always highlight as much, but more than in conservation, we in society don't highlight those connections enough. Ecology is all about the webs of connection between species and the interdependence between species and the places in which we live. But that's not necessarily always highlighted. We do focus on the conservation plan for this specific species as if it is in isolation from the habitat needs of a whole bunch of species and us as well. Anyone else want to add to that? Katia, do you have any additional thoughts?
I do, and I want to connect it to the future of conservation, because I think a lot of the Indigenous perspectives on conservation are focused on changing conservation. And I think you said so much of it, Naamal, there. But I think it's very important to think about how a lot of conservation practices are inspired by Indigenous practices. I actually read a paper recently that had a quote from the 1800s from a Western person that literally said this: we are literally trying to learn how Indigenous people manage their land. And so I think, I think that says a lot. And so I think, but something that is very important is that Indigenous people want ownership over their practices. And as well as something like Naamal mentioned that differs between Western and environmental management is the ethics and culture that is put in it. So while Western people may be doing prescribed fires, oftentimes those fires are cultural and sacred to Indigenous people. So while, Western people may be doing polycultures, they're separate from the three sisters that are as well connected to important and sacred cultural stories. But I think in order for Indigenous perspectives on conservation and diverse perspectives and priorities to really be centered in conservation, there is going to be a lot of redressing of the history and colonial impacts of conservation, because conservation has intricately been connected to displacement of indigenous people from their lands, and reinforcing Western land ownership and management. And as I've been reading more about this through this fellowship and through my graduate education, it has come up how, conservation easements mostly benefit Western landowners that are wealthier. USDA programs actively excluded diverse people and women from accessing those funds. So there has been active exclusion. And so it's important to redress this exclusion, as well as consider how in centering Indigenous people and diverse people, they're going to be bringing diverse perspectives of nature and diverse approaches that will go just beyond saving a species, like Naamal mentioned. It will go to holistic approaches.
Thank you, Katia. There are two excellent questions in the chat about storytelling, which is how I wanted to end this, with Planet Forward being the co-host. We each have a story. We each have a perspective on this that adds to that entanglement or that sense of interconnectedness. We also do have a new round of Conservation and Justice Fellowship projects, some of which build from the work that Harrison and Katia began in 2022. I put the link in the chat to that, but I want to read these questions because I think we may not have enough time to answer them, but it's good to leave us with the idea that stories have power. Elizabeth Berry asked, how can we harness the power of storytelling to get people to really get it, that it's our survival at stake, that along with destroying ecosystems and species, we're harming ourselves and our only home? How can we reach people who don't seem to care about any of it, not even climate change? I think it's good to leave people with questions, not necessarily answers only. Maggie Liddell asks, how do we navigate and expand a feeling of camaraderie and interconnectedness with the natural world? How do we as scholars, artists, storytellers bridge the gap with communities and individuals that may not value such connections? To that, I'd say that I think most communities do value the connections, but they might be hidden or they might be thinking of them in a different way. And so storytelling has the power to unearth those connections. And I think a lot of the work that we do is in bridging or translating across communities or across ideas or ways of knowing, because we do all care, but we are not always allowed to express that caring. And our work doesn't always allow us to, too many of us are caught up in these extractive systems that we were talking about. Yeah, we are out of time, so I don't want to keep us any longer, but it was such a pleasure. Harrison, Carl, Katia, Kim, and Erica and Aaron on the back end as well, supporting us to have this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Feel free to be in touch with us directly. My email address is on the Conservation and Justice Fellowship's website. Thank you to Planet Forward. Bye all.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. It was a great conversation.
Thank you.